You're not going to believe what I'm about to tell you, but I've got the footage to prove it. Last month, my trail cameras captured something hunting elk in the backcountry that defies explanation. I've been a park ranger for 15 years, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains had to offer. I was wrong. It started like any other October morning. I loaded my ATV with 3 trail cameras and headed into the backcountry to monitor elk migration patterns. The herd had been moving through our territory for weeks, following their ancient routes between feeding grounds and water sources. My supervisor wanted documentation for the annual wildlife report, so I volunteered to place cameras in strategic locations. The first camera went up overlooking a meadow where elk appeared almost daily. It was a perfect spot. Open grassland surrounded by dense forest with clear sight lines in every direction. The elk felt safe there, and we'd gotten some incredible footage of entire herds grazing in the early morning light. The second camera I mounted near a creek where animals came to drink. This location always produced good results because every creature in the area needed water. Bears, deer, elk, mountain lions, they all used this spot. The creek ran year-round, fed by snowmelt from higher elevations, and the bank showed constant animal traffic. The third camera was different. I positioned it watching a narrow ravine that served as an escape route for elk when predators appeared. This was new territory for me, a steep, rocky passage between 2 ridges that I'd only recently discovered. The ravine was maybe 20 feet wide at its narrowest point, with thick timber on both sides. If something spooked the elk in the meadow, they'd bolt straight through this gap. I spent most of the day getting the cameras positioned correctly, adjusting angles, and testing battery life. Each one was a decent model, nothing fancy, but reliable enough to capture clear images day and night. The infrared sensors had a range of about 40 feet, and the memory cards could store thousands of photos. I set them to take pictures every 30 seconds when motion was detected. By late afternoon, all 3 cameras were operational. I marked their GPS coordinates on my handheld unit and headed back to the ranger station. The forecast called for clear weather for the next week, so I figured I'd check the cameras the following weekend. 7 days later, I returned to collect the initial batch of footage. The first 2 cameras had performed exactly as expected. Hundreds of photos showed elk herds moving through at dawn and dusk, mule deer browsing during midday, and black bears passing through in the early hours. Nothing unusual, just typical wildlife behavior. The third camera, positioned at the ravine, told a different story. Most of the photos were normal. Elk using the passage, deer bounding through, the occasional coyote. But scattered throughout the memory card were frames that made me pause. In the background of several shots, barely visible among the trees, was a dark figure. At first glance, it looked like another hiker. The shape was upright, moving between tree trunks about 100 yards from the camera. But something felt off about it. The figure appeared in photos taken at different times, early morning, late evening, even middle of the night. What kind of person would be wandering around out there at 2 a.m.? Looking closer, I noticed the figure seemed to be following the same routes the elk used. When the herd moved north through the ravine, the dark shape appeared in the northern tree line. When they traveled south, it showed up on the southern side. Either this was an incredible coincidence, or something was deliberately tracking the elk movements. I figured it was probably just a dedicated wildlife photographer or maybe a poacher scouting the area. Both explanations made sense, even if the timing seemed odd. I made a mental note to keep an eye out for unauthorized activity and decided to check the cameras again in another week. The following week brought the worst storm we'd seen in months. Rain hammered the mountains for 3 straight days, with winds gusting over 60 miles per hour. I knew the cameras would take a beating, but there wasn't much I could do except wait it out. When the weather finally cleared, I drove back up to check on the equipment. The access road had been partially washed out, and fallen trees blocked the path in several places. I had to hike the last mile carrying a chainsaw to cut through the debris. The first camera, positioned in the open meadow, had taken direct hits from the storm. Wind had twisted it around a tree trunk, and the waterproof housing had failed. The memory card was completely waterlogged, useless. The second camera near the creek had suffered similar damage. A falling branch had knocked it into the water, and despite the supposedly weatherproof case, moisture had destroyed the electronics. I was frustrated but not surprised. Mountain weather could destroy equipment without warning, and I'd learned to expect some losses. The real disappointment was losing whatever footage those cameras had captured during the storm. The third camera, protected by the thick forest canopy around the ravine, had somehow survived intact. The housing showed minor scratches from flying debris, but the seal had held. When I popped out the memory card, it was dry as a bone. Back at the ranger station, I loaded the photos onto my computer. Most were what I expected: wind-blown vegetation, rain streaking across the lens, darkness. But one image, time-stamped at 6:23 a.m. on the second day of the storm, made me lean closer to the screen. A massive elk stood in the center of the frame, head down, feeding on grass in a small meadow just beyond the ravine. The storm had passed through the area, leaving everything glistening in the early morning light. It was a beautiful shot, the kind that would look great in a wildlife magazine. But in the background, barely visible at the edge of the tree line about 150 yards away, stood something that made my blood run cold. The figure was enormous, clearly bipedal, and covered in what looked like dark brown fur. It stood motionless behind a large pine tree, positioned so that only part of its torso and one arm were visible. The proportions were all wrong for a human. The shoulders were too broad, the arms too long. Even from that distance, I could estimate it was well over 8 feet tall. What disturbed me most was how it appeared to be watching the elk. There was something intentional about its posture, something that suggested intelligence and focus. This wasn't a random animal passing through. This was a predator studying its prey. I stared at that photo for probably an hour, zooming in on different sections, adjusting the contrast, looking for anything that might explain what I was seeing. Maybe it was a shadow, or a trick of the light, or debris from the storm arranged in a way that created an illusion. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, the image remained clear and undeniable. Something had been watching that elk with obvious intelligence, and it wasn't anything I could identify from my 15 years in these mountains. The next batch of photos revealed something even more unsettling. The timestamps showed a sequence of events that had unfolded over the course of about 20 minutes, starting just after the image of the creature behind the pine tree. In the first frame of the sequence, the elk was still grazing peacefully in the meadow. The creature was no longer visible behind the pine tree. For a moment, I thought maybe it had simply moved on, spooked by something, or continuing its journey through the forest. The second photo, taken 3 minutes later, showed the elk had raised its head and was looking toward the tree line where the creature had been hiding. Its ears were forward, alert, but not yet alarmed. This was typical behavior. Elk were always scanning for potential threats. But the third photo revealed why the elk had become alert. The creature had moved. It was now visible much closer to the meadow, crouched low behind a fallen log about 100 yards from the elk. The animal's massive frame was compressed into a surprisingly compact hunting position, demonstrating an understanding of terrain that I'd never seen in any wild animal. What struck me most was how the creature had used the landscape to its advantage. Between its original position behind the pine tree and its new location behind the log, there were dozens of potential hiding spots. boulders, thick brush, standing timber. The creature had somehow moved through that terrain without being detected by one of the most alert animals in the forest. The fourth photo showed the elk beginning to graze again, apparently satisfied that whatever threat it had sensed was gone. Meanwhile, the creature remained perfectly motionless behind the log, positioned downwind of its target. This demonstrated not only patience but an understanding of how scent travels, knowledge that even experienced human hunters sometimes forget. The next several photos documented the most remarkable display of hunting strategy I'd ever witnessed. The creature continued moving closer, using every available piece of cover. It advanced through tall grass that would have concealed a smaller animal completely, but even at its enormous size, the creature somehow managed to stay hidden from the elk's view. What amazed me was how it selected its route. Rather than taking the most direct path, which would have exposed it in several open areas, the creature followed a winding course that kept obstacles between itself and its target. It moved only when the elk's head was down, feeding, freezing completely whenever the animal looked up. This wasn't the behavior of a typical predator. Bears charge in with brute force. Mountain lions rely on a single, explosive ambush from close range. Wolves work in packs to confuse and surround their prey. But this creature demonstrated individual intelligence and planning that I'd only seen in humans. Over the course of 45 minutes, documented in 15 separate photos, the creature methodically closed the distance. It seemed to understand exactly how close it could get before the elk would detect its presence. When it finally reached a position about 30 yards from its target, hidden behind a cluster of young aspen trees, it stopped and waited. The elk it had been stalking was a massive bull, probably weighing close to 800 pounds. The animal had separated slightly from the main herd to feed on a patch of particularly green grass near a small stream. This isolation hadn't happened by accident. The creature had somehow maneuvered its target away from the protection of the group. The last few photos of the hunt showed the creature's final approach. It had waited until the bull was completely focused on feeding, head down near the water's edge. Then it made its move. The creature emerged from behind the aspen trees and covered the remaining 30 yards in what must have been a matter of seconds. The photos captured only the beginning and end of this charge. The motion was too fast for the camera's sensor to document clearly. One frame showed the creature still hidden behind the trees. The next showed it airborne, massive arms extended in the process of tackling the elk. The bull's head was just beginning to turn, alerted by some sound or movement, but it was already too late. The following photo was blurry, probably due to the impact vibrating the camera, but it clearly showed both the creature and the elk on the ground. The bull's legs were tangled beneath its body, and the creature's arms were wrapped around its neck in what looked like a submission hold. What happened next was captured in devastating detail. The creature had positioned itself behind the elk and appeared to be applying pressure to its neck. Within 3 photos, spanning maybe 2 minutes, the elk stopped struggling. The hunt was over. The subsequent footage showed behavior that convinced me beyond any doubt that this creature possessed near-human intelligence. After confirming the elk was dead, the creature began field dressing it with a level of skill that would impress most experienced hunters. Using what appeared to be a sharp stone, the creature made precise incisions to drain the blood and remove the internal organs. It worked methodically, wasting nothing. The heart, liver, and other organs were carefully set aside, apparently for immediate consumption. The creature ate parts of the elk raw, starting with the organs. This behavior isn't uncommon among predators. Organs are highly nutritious and spoil quickly. But what struck me was how selective the creature was. It consumed only specific parts and left others untouched. as if following some internal knowledge about what was most valuable nutritionally. After feeding, the creature began preparing the carcass for transport. It used its massive strength to break down the elk into manageable pieces, separating the hindquarters from the front shoulders and removing the head. Each piece was systematically arranged, and the creature seemed to be planning how to carry everything efficiently. The final photos of this sequence showed the creature loading meat onto what appeared to be an improvised travois, a crude sled made from elk antlers and strips of hide. This tool use was sophisticated beyond anything I'd expected. The creature had not only hunted successfully, but had also prepared equipment for transporting its kill back to wherever it lived. 2 days later, I hiked out to investigate the kill site in person. The location was exactly where the photos indicated, about 2 miles from the nearest trail and completely hidden from casual view. What I found there convinced me that the footage was authentic and that something extraordinary had occurred. The first thing I noticed was the smell. A strong, musky odor hung in the air around the entire area, unlike anything I'd encountered in 15 years of wildlife work. It wasn't the smell of decay or bear musk. This was something completely different, almost human but not quite. Near the creek where the elk had been feeding, I found footprints preserved in soft mud. These tracks were massive, easily 18 inches long and 7 inches wide. They showed clear toe impressions and deep heel marks that indicated enormous weight. I made plaster casts of the 3 best prints, measuring and photographing everything. The stride length between prints was nearly 5 feet, suggesting a creature with legs much longer than any human. The depth of the impressions indicated something weighing at least 400 pounds, possibly more. Most telling were the small details. The prints showed a flexible foot structure with individual toe marks that bent and gripped the soft earth. Broken branches throughout the area provided more evidence of the creature's size. Limbs were snapped off at heights of 9 to 10 feet, far above where any known animal could reach. Some breaks looked fresh, probably occurring during the hunt when the creature moved quickly through dense vegetation. The blood evidence at the kill site matched the sequence I'd seen in the photos. Dark stains marked where the elk had fallen, and drag marks showed where the carcass had been moved for processing. Scattered around the area were small bone fragments and pieces of hide that the creature had discarded. While documenting the kill site, I discovered something that changed my entire understanding of what had happened. About 50 yards uphill from where the elk died, hidden in a thick patch of brush overlooking the meadow, was a crude shelter. The structure was built into the natural landscape so skillfully that I almost walked past it. Branches had been interwoven and packed with moss to create a concealed blind that provided an optimal view of the entire meadow while remaining completely invisible from below. The shelter was large enough for something the size of the creature to hide comfortably. Inside the shelter, I found clear evidence of repeated use. The ground was packed down from long occupation, and there were small caches where food had been stored. Dried berries, nuts, and what appeared to be strips of jerky were hidden in waterproof containers made from animal hide. Multiple entry and exit routes led away from the shelter through dense undergrowth. These paths were expertly concealed, using natural deer trails and rocky areas that wouldn't show footprints. The creature had obviously spent considerable time planning and preparing this hunting position. Most impressive was the tactical advantage of the location. From inside the shelter, the creature could observe the entire meadow, monitor wind direction, and track elk movement patterns without any risk of detection. This wasn't random hunting. This was systematic surveillance and planning. Over the next week, I expanded my search area and found evidence that the creature had established a significant territory in this remote section of the mountains. Large trees were stripped of bark in distinctive patterns, long vertical gouges that could only have been made by something with immense strength and reach. Rock cairns were stacked at regular intervals along game trails, clearly marking boundaries or navigation points. These weren't random piles of stone. They were deliberately constructed markers placed at strategic locations. The pattern suggested an intelligent system for organizing and claiming territory. Most unsettling was how other wildlife had responded to these markers. Areas that should have been bustling with animal activity were eerily quiet. Deer trails that had been heavily used for years were now abandoned. Even predators like bears and mountain lions seemed to be avoiding marked zones entirely. The territory appeared to cover approximately 4 square miles of prime habitat, encompassing the best water sources, food areas, and shelter locations in this section of the park. Whatever creature had claimed this land had done so systematically and completely. My investigation took another dramatic turn when I retrieved the next batch of photos from the surviving camera. The images revealed not one creature, but at least 3 distinct individuals working together. The first photos showed the largest creature, the one I'd seen hunting the elk, accompanied by a smaller figure that appeared to be female. She was perhaps 7 feet tall, lighter in build, with longer hair that almost looked groomed. The two moved together with obvious familiarity, communicating through gestures and brief physical contact. Later photos revealed a third individual, smaller still and clearly juvenile. This young creature stayed close to the female, often holding her hand as they traveled through the forest. The family dynamic was unmistakable. 2 adults protecting and teaching their offspring. Most remarkable was how they cooperated in food gathering and processing. Photos showed them working together to transport meat from kill sites, taking turns carrying heavy loads, and sharing tasks like a human family. The juvenile watched and mimicked the adult's behavior, clearly learning essential survival skills. Their social organization was complex beyond anything I'd expected. They had established sleeping areas, food storage locations, and even what appeared to be designated bathroom areas downwind from their living spaces. This level of planning and cooperation suggested intelligence that rivaled higher primates. The camera continued documenting behaviors that challenged everything I thought I knew about wildlife. These creatures weren't just using simple tools. They were manufacturing sophisticated equipment for specific purposes. I captured images of them fashioning carrying pouches from elk hide, using stone knives to cut precise patterns and strips of sinew to stitch the pieces together. The finished products looked like primitive backpacks, complete with shoulder straps and drawstring closures. They used long sticks to extract insects from rotting logs, modifying the tools by sharpening the ends to the right diameter for different tasks. When the sticks broke or wore out, they'd quickly craft replacements from available materials. Most impressive were the elevated food caches they constructed. Using a combination of rope-like vines and wooden platforms, they built storage systems 20 feet off the ground to protect meat from scavengers. These structures required engineering knowledge, understanding load distribution, weather resistance, and access methods. Their problem-solving abilities were evident in dozens of photos. When a cache rope broke, they quickly improvised repairs using backup materials. When rain threatened stored food, they constructed overhead covers. Every challenge was met with practical solutions that demonstrated advanced reasoning. After about 3 weeks of observation, something changed. The creature's behavior shifted dramatically, suggesting they had become aware of the camera's presence. Instead of moving freely through the monitored area, they began avoiding direct camera angles while still using the territory. Photos from this period showed only partial glimpses: a hand reaching around a tree, a foot disappearing behind a boulder, shadows moving just outside the frame. They had clearly identified the camera's location and field of view, then adapted their movement patterns accordingly. They also shifted to primarily nocturnal activity. Most of the clear photos were now time-stamped between midnight and 5 a.m. during hours when the infrared sensor provided the best concealment. This suggested they understood the camera's capabilities better than most animals would. Most telling was how they used established deer trails to bypass the camera's position. These paths approached from angles that kept them in the camera's blind spots while still allowing access to their territory. Such sophisticated evasion tactics indicated not just intelligence, but specific understanding of human surveillance methods. 3 days after I'd noticed the creature's changed behavior, I had an encounter that I'll never forget. I decided to check the camera at dawn, hoping to surprise whatever was avoiding detection. The plan was to approach quietly and see if I could spot anything moving in the area. I parked my ATV about a quarter-mile away and hiked in on foot, moving as quietly as possible through the pre-dawn darkness. The forest was dead silent, no bird calls, no small animal sounds, nothing. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. As I approached the camera location, staying low and using trees for cover, I heard a branch snap somewhere ahead of me. I froze, thinking it might be an elk or deer moving through the area. Then I heard it again, a deliberate, careful footstep that sounded nothing like hoofed animals. I crept forward another 20 yards until I had a clear view of the camera and the ravine beyond. Everything looked normal in the gray pre-dawn light. The camera appeared untouched and there were no obvious signs of disturbance. That's when something massive stepped out of the brush only 30 feet away from me. The creature moved with complete silence until it chose to reveal itself. One moment I was scanning empty forest. The next moment this enormous figure was standing in plain sight, watching me with obvious intelligence. We both froze. For several seconds that felt like hours, we stared at each other in mutual recognition. The creature was even more impressive up close, easily 8.5 feet tall, with a build that suggested immense physical power. Its chest and shoulders were broader than any human, and its arms extended well past where its knees would be. The face was the most unsettling part. It clearly showed intelligence and awareness. This wasn't a mindless animal. The eyes reflected cunning and evaluation, as if the creature was assessing whether I posed a threat. Its features blended human and ape characteristics in a way that was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. After what felt like an eternity, the creature took one step backwards, then another, melting into the forest as silently as it had appeared. I remained frozen in place for another 5 minutes, heart pounding, before I finally worked up the courage to retrieve the memory card and get out of there. The close encounter had provided details that the camera couldn't capture. The creature was covered in thick, dark brown fur that looked coarse and weathered, like it had been exposed to harsh outdoor conditions year-round. Lighter patches on the chest and inner arms suggested this wasn't uniform coloring but a natural pattern. Its facial features were unlike anything I'd seen before. The skull structure was more elongated than human, with a prominent brow ridge and a jaw that projected forward slightly. But the eyes were unmistakably intelligent, showing awareness and calculation that no animal possessed. The creature's build was perfectly adapted for life in this rugged terrain. Its powerful legs and low center of gravity would provide stability on steep slopes and rocky surfaces. The long arms would be ideal for climbing and traversing the thick forest canopy. Everything about its physiology suggested a species specifically evolved for this environment. Despite its enormous size, the creature moved with surprising grace and agility. There was no clumsiness or awkward movement. Every step was deliberate and controlled. This combination of size and coordination would make it a formidable predator, and nearly impossible to track if it didn't want to be found. After the close encounter, my professional curiosity overcame my fear. I had to know more about these creatures and where they lived. Using the footprints I'd found earlier as a starting point, I began tracking their movements through the forest. The trail led away from the kill site toward higher elevation, following a route that stayed within heavy timber cover. Every few hundred yards, I found additional signs: broken vegetation, claw marks on trees, and occasional footprints where the ground was soft enough to retain impressions. The creatures were clearly following established paths through their territory, but these routes weren't random. They connected key resources, water sources, food areas, and what appeared to be regular resting spots. This was evidence of intelligent land use and territorial organization. After following tracks for about a mile, I reached a rocky outcrop where the trail seemed to disappear. The stone surface wouldn't hold footprints, and I spent nearly an hour searching for where the trail continued. I was about to give up when I noticed something odd about a cluster of boulders near the base of a cliff. What I had initially taken for natural rock formation was actually concealing a cave entrance. Fallen boulders had been carefully arranged to hide an opening in the cliff face, creating a natural camouflage that would be invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The smell hit me before I even reached the cave entrance. That same musky odor I detected at the kill site, but much stronger here. This was clearly where the creatures lived, and they'd been using it for a considerable time. I didn't dare enter the cave, both for safety reasons and out of respect for what was obviously their home. But I could see enough from the entrance to understand the scope of their living situation. The cave extended back into the cliff much farther than I could see, with multiple chambers branching off from the main passage. Fresh elk bones were scattered around the entrance, clearly the remains of recent kills. But these weren't randomly discarded. They were arranged in neat piles, sorted by size and type. Some bones had been cracked open to extract marrow, while others showed precise cuts that indicated tool use in butchering. Most interesting were the artifacts I found near the cave entrance. Flat rocks had been arranged as a primitive food preparation area with clear evidence of use. Burn marks, grease stains, and small bone fragments embedded in the stone surface. This was sophisticated food processing that went far beyond simple consumption. Woven grass containers sat in recessed areas of the cave wall, apparently used for carrying water from the nearby creek. These weren't roughly made. They showed careful construction and attention to waterproofing. Some still contained water, suggesting they were part of an active storage system. Around the cave area, I discovered what could only be described as a primitive workshop. Sharp-edged stones had been systematically shaped into cutting tools, with different implements designed for specific tasks. Some were heavy chopping tools, others were fine-bladed knives for detailed work. Wooden stakes had been sharpened to perfect points using stone scrapers. These spears ranged from light-throwing weapons to heavy thrusting implements that could bring down large game. The craftsmanship was impressive. Each tool showed evidence of careful planning and skilled execution. Most remarkable was evidence of controlled fire use. In several sheltered spots around the cave area, I found fire rings constructed from carefully selected stones. Ash deposits and charcoal fragments indicated these fires had been used repeatedly over an extended period. The creatures had even developed a system for fire maintenance. Dry tinder and kindling were stored in protected areas, ready for use. Fire-starting materials, flint, steel pyrite, and char cloth made from shredded bark were kept in waterproof containers near each fire location. This level of technological development suggested not just intelligence, but cultural knowledge passed down through generations. These weren't behaviors that individual creatures had figured out on their own. This was learned skill that had been refined over time. As autumn progressed and temperatures dropped, my camera documented how the creature family adapted to changing conditions. Their behavior shifted from opportunistic hunting to systematic preparation for winter survival. They began constructing more substantial shelters using deadfall timber and thick brush. These weren't temporary sleeping spots, but engineered structures designed to provide warmth and protection during harsh weather. The building techniques showed understanding of insulation, drainage, and structural stability. Food caching became more intensive. Multiple hidden storage sites were established throughout their territory, each containing different types of preserved food. Meat was dried into jerky using smoke from controlled fires. Nuts, berries, and roots were stored in various containers and hidden in locations that would remain accessible even under snow. The family group's social dynamics also changed. They spent more time together, often sharing body heat during rest periods. The juvenile was kept closer to the adults and was actively taught essential survival skills like fire maintenance and food preservation. Most impressive was how they modified their hunting patterns. Instead of the patient, strategic approach I'd witnessed with the elk, they became more aggressive and efficient. Time was now a factor. They needed to acquire and process as much food as possible before winter made hunting nearly impossible. When I filed my incident report with park headquarters, I expected skepticism or maybe some interest in documenting an unusual wildlife encounter. What I didn't expect was the speed and intensity of the official response. Within 2 days of submitting my report, a team of officials arrived at our ranger station. They weren't Park Service personnel or state wildlife officers. These were federal agents with credentials I didn't recognize and authority that clearly superseded my supervisors. They confiscated all my cameras, memory cards, and documentation without explanation. When I asked about getting the equipment back, they said it was needed for ongoing research and that replacement gear would be provided. The replacements never arrived. More disturbing was what happened next. All trail cameras in the area suddenly required maintenance, according to a directive from regional headquarters. Rangers were instructed to remove every camera within a 5-mile radius of my sighting location and return them to a designated facility for software updates. Access roads leading to the creature's territory were blocked with new gates and no trespassing signs. The official explanation was that biological research was in progress, but no details were provided about what kind of research or how long the closure would last. Within a week, I received transfer orders to a ranger station 300 miles away. The reassignment was described as a career development opportunity, but the timing was obviously not coincidental. My new position involved managing visitor centers and giving educational talks, desk work that kept me far from wilderness areas. When I tried to discuss my findings with colleagues, I was told that the incident had been classified and that further discussion could jeopardize my career. The official position was that I had documented an encounter with a previously unknown bear species and that scientific study was ongoing. My supervisor, who had worked with me for 8 years, suddenly became evasive about the whole situation. He suggested I focus on my new assignment and avoid speculation about what I might have seen. The message was clear: this topic was off limits. For my new assignment, I kept in touch with rangers still working in the area. They reported dramatic increases in helicopter activity throughout the region where I'd encountered the creatures. Flights occurred at all hours, often using aircraft with no visible identification numbers. Construction crews appeared and began installing sophisticated fencing around the creature's territory. The barriers weren't typical park infrastructure. These were high-security installations with electronic monitoring equipment and warning systems. Work continued around the clock, suggesting urgency that didn't match the official explanation of routine biological research. Local hunting permits for the entire region were mysteriously suspended. Longtime hunters who had used the area for decades suddenly found their applications denied without explanation. When they complained to state wildlife officials, they were told the area was temporarily closed for habitat restoration projects. Media inquiries about the unusual activity were quickly dismissed. When local newspapers attempted to report on the helicopter flights and construction work, they were told by park officials that the activity was routine maintenance that didn't warrant coverage. Over the following months, the official response grew more sophisticated and comprehensive. The creature's territory was reclassified as a sensitive research area with restricted access. New regulations required special permits for any activity within a 10-mile radius, and these permits were almost impossible to obtain. Scientific institutions began receiving government grants to study primate behavior in North American ecosystems. These research projects were heavily classified, with participants required to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements. The funding amounts were significant enough to ensure institutional cooperation and silence. Wildlife organizations that had previously advocated for public access to wilderness areas suddenly supported the new restrictions. Their position was that the research being conducted was too sensitive to allow public interference, and that the long-term benefits justified temporary closures. Even other park rangers began reporting unusual encounters in different locations. Stories of large, unidentified creatures were surfacing from wilderness areas across the country, but each report was quickly classified and the witnesses transferred to different assignments. Before my transfer, I managed to retrieve one final memory card that had been overlooked during the confiscation. The photos on this card provided the most compelling evidence yet of the creature's intelligence and sophistication. Multiple images showed the family group engaged in complex problem-solving activities. When heavy rains had washed out one of their food caches, they worked together to devise a new storage system that would be flood-proof. The solution involved relocating supplies to higher ground and constructing drainage channels to redirect water flow. They demonstrated advanced planning in their hunting strategies. Photos showed them working together to drive elk toward predetermined ambush points, with each family member taking specific positions to ensure success. This coordination required communication, timing, and shared understanding of tactics. Most impressive was their apparent ability to learn and adapt. After discovering the trail camera, they had modified all their movement patterns to avoid detection while still using their territory effectively. They had essentially learned to work around human technology without abandoning their established lifestyle. What I documented over those few weeks convinced me that these creatures represent something far more significant than just another large animal species. Their behavior patterns, social structure, and technological capabilities suggest intelligence that approaches human levels in some areas, while remaining uniquely adapted to wilderness survival. They showed no aggression toward humans beyond defending their territory when threatened. Their hunting was purely for survival, not sport or dominance. The family structure indicated complex emotional bonds and cooperative childcare that ensured survival skills were passed to the next generation. Most important was how they had learned to coexist with human activity while remaining hidden. They understood our technology, our behavior patterns, and our limitations. They had developed countermeasures that allowed them to maintain their lifestyle while avoiding detection by all but the most accidental encounters. Based on the official response to my findings, it's clear that government agencies have been aware of these creatures for much longer than they've admitted publicly. The speed and coordination of the cover-up suggested existing protocols designed specifically for this type of discovery. The classification of my evidence and the systematic suppression of similar reports indicated that this wasn't an isolated incident. There must be documented encounters dating back years or decades, all managed through the same process of confiscation, transfer, and silence. The substantial resources devoted to monitoring and protecting the creature's habitat suggested long-term study and possibly even communication attempts. The research infrastructure being established was too extensive and sophisticated for a recent discovery. This had to be the expansion of an existing program. What worried me most was how habitat destruction and human encroachment threatened these creatures' survival. Their territory requirements were enormous. They needed undisturbed wilderness areas that were becoming increasingly rare. Climate change and development pressure were eliminating the remote habitats where they could exist undetected. The family group I documented represented a tiny population trying to survive in an ever-shrinking world. If there were only a few dozen or a few hundred of these creatures left, their genetic diversity and long-term survival were already at risk. Most tragic was how their intelligence and adaptability might not be enough to ensure survival. They had learned to avoid humans and hide from technology, but they couldn't hide from environmental changes that were altering their entire ecosystem. The physical evidence. Before my transfer, I managed to preserve some evidence that hadn't been confiscated. The plaster casts I'd made of footprints were stored at my home, along with photos. I should have died in those mountains. Any rational analysis of what happened during that October night in 1983 leads to the same conclusion. Two young soldiers, alone in the wilderness, face to face with something that could have torn them apart without effort. Instead, I'm sitting in my suburban home 40 years later, writing words I was ordered never to speak, about an encounter that officially never happened. The classified after-action report buried in some Pentagon filing cabinet lists our training exercise as completed without incident. 2 Army Reserve personnel completed advanced land navigation and survival drills in Chattahoochee National Forest, Georgia. Event logged per training protocol. No further action required. But I remember the eyes, 8 feet off the ground, reflecting moonlight like polished glass, studying us with an intelligence that made every hair on my body stand at attention. I remember footprints in the morning earth that were 18 inches long and 5 toes wide. I remember the smell, musky, organic, alien, that lingered in our campsite long after the creature had melted back into shadows that seemed too deep for the available light. Most of all, I remember the commanding officer who told us that unusual reports from training exercises served no useful military purpose and could damage a soldier's career prospects. The message was delivered with the kind of quiet authority that transforms memories into classified secrets, experiences into things that never happened. 40 years of silence. 40 years of carrying a story that sounds like fiction but felt more real than anything before or since. 40 years of wondering if I was the only one who remembered that night when the impossible revealed itself to 2 young men who were just trying to prove they belonged in the ranks of the Rangers. Then, 3 weeks ago, I received a phone call that changed everything. A voice I hadn't heard in decades, rougher now but unmistakably familiar. My former partner, reaching across 40 years of enforced silence with news that made my blood run cold. It's happening again. The disappearances, the strange reports, the carefully worded official explanations that say nothing while implying everything. And this time, people are asking questions that military protocol can't answer. This is the story they never wanted told. The story of 2 encounters, separated by 14 years, but connected by something far older and more complex than human understanding. The story of first contact with an intelligence that has been sharing our world while remaining invisible, protecting secrets that might be too dangerous for humanity to acknowledge. I'm writing this because silence has become complicity, and because some truths are too important to die with the men who witnessed them. I'm writing this because somewhere in the mountains of North Georgia, ancient minds are still making decisions about humanity's future, and we don't even know the conversation is happening. My name doesn't matter, my rank doesn't matter. What matters is what we saw, what we learned, and what it means for everyone who walks in wild places where old rules still apply and older intelligences still watch from shadows deeper than any map can measure. The morning mist clung to the ridgelines of the Chattahoochee National Forest like smoke from a dying campfire. I pressed my back against the rough bark of an ancient oak, feeling the weight of my rucksack settle into the familiar ache between my shoulder blades. The radio crackled once, then fell silent. We were officially on our own. 48 hours, that's what they'd given us. 48 hours to prove we could survive in these mountains with nothing but basic gear and the skills they'd drilled into us at Camp Merrill. The other soldiers had fanned out across different sectors of the forest, each pair given coordinates that would keep them miles apart. The isolation was intentional. Rangers operated alone behind enemy lines with no backup coming over the hill. This exercise would test whether we'd absorb that lesson or wash out like so many others before us. My partner moved ahead of me with the practiced stealth of someone who'd grown up hunting in terrain like this. His boots found purchase on rocks and fallen logs, while mine seemed to find every twig and loose stone in Georgia. The man was a ghost in olive drab, and I found myself both grateful for his competence and slightly intimidated by it. We'd been paired randomly, two reservists thrown together for this final phase of ranger training, but it was clear one of us belonged here more than the other. The October air carried the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. Somewhere in the canopy above, a woodpecker hammered against dead wood in an irregular rhythm that seemed to echo off the mountainsides. The Appalachians stretched endlessly in every direction, ridge after ridge of green peaks fading into blue distance. It was beautiful country, but there was something primal about it too, something that reminded you how small and vulnerable humans really were when stripped of their cities and technology. We'd been walking for 3 hours when we found our first checkpoint. A small metal canister hung from a wire stretched between two trees, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside was a slip of paper with new coordinates and a cryptic message about adapting to changing mission parameters. Standard stuff, but it meant our route would take us deeper into the wilderness than originally planned. The terrain grew rougher as we climbed. What had started as well-maintained hiking trails gave way to game paths, then to nothing but compass bearings and topographical intuition. My partner consulted the map frequently, correlating landmarks with the squiggly lines that represented elevation changes. The forest closed around us like a living thing, branches interlocking overhead to create a green tunnel that filtered the sunlight into scattered coins of gold. By late afternoon, we'd covered nearly 15 miles of rugged ground. My legs burned and my lungs worked harder in the thin mountain air. But there was satisfaction in the exhaustion. This was what we'd trained for, what separated rangers from regular infantry. The ability to keep moving when your body wanted to quit, to think clearly when fatigue clouded your judgment, to remain effective when comfort was a distant memory. We made camp in a small clearing beside a creek that tumbled down from somewhere high above. The water was clear and cold, tasting of granite and moss. While my partner set up our shelter, a simple lean-to constructed from fallen branches and our poncho, I gathered firewood and scouted the perimeter. The forest felt different here, older somehow. The trees were massive, their trunks disappearing into shadows that seemed too deep for the available light. That first night passed without incident. We ate cold MREs and drank creek water treated with iodine tablets. The temperature dropped quickly after sunset, and we huddled close to our small fire, feeding it carefully to avoid creating too much light or smoke. Rangers learned to be invisible, even in training exercises. The instructors could appear anywhere, testing our fieldcraft and tactical awareness. I took the first watch while my partner slept. The forest at night was a different world entirely. Sounds that were comforting during the day became ominous in the darkness. Every rustle of leaves could be an instructor trying to catch us off guard, every crack of a branch a potential threat assessment. But gradually, I learned to distinguish between the normal sounds of a living forest and anything that might represent danger. An owl called from somewhere across the creek, its hollow voice echoing off the mountainside. Something large crashed through the underbrush in the distance, probably a deer spooked by our presence. The fire crackled and popped, sending occasional sparks spiraling up toward the stars visible through gaps in the canopy. It was peaceful in its way, peaceful and utterly isolated. The second day brought new challenges. Our order were to reach a specific ridgeline by nightfall, but the terrain between us and that objective was some of the roughest in the national forest. We climbed through dense laurel thickets that grabbed at our equipment and forced us to crawl on hands and knees. We navigated around cliff faces that dropped away into misty valleys hundreds of feet below. We forded streams swollen with recent rain, the current strong enough to knock a careless man off his feet. My respect for my partner continued to grow. He seemed to read the landscape like a book, finding routes through impossible terrain, water sources when our canteens ran low, shelter when sudden squalls swept across the ridges. More importantly, he never made me feel inadequate for my own struggles with the environment. When I slipped on wet rocks or lost the trail in thick vegetation, he simply waited patiently for me to recover and find my way. By afternoon, we were behind schedule. The ridgeline that had looked achievable on the map was proving more elusive in reality. Every time we thought we'd reached our objective, another valley opened up before us, requiring a detour that added hours to our movement. The sun was already slanting low through the trees when we finally gained the elevation we needed. The view from the ridge was spectacular. The Chattahoochee National Forest spread out below us like a green ocean, ridge after ridge rolling away toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, other pairs of soldiers were fighting their own battles with terrain and fatigue. But up here, we felt like the only humans for 100 miles in any direction. We found a defensible position among some large boulders and began preparing for our second night in the field. This time, we were more confident in our routine. Water from a small spring that bubbled up between the rocks, a sheltered spot for our lean-to that would be invisible from below, a fire position that could be quickly extinguished if necessary. But something felt different about this place. There was a tension in the air that hadn't been present at our previous campsite. The forest seemed unusually quiet. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind had died to an unnatural stillness. My partner felt it too. I could see it in the way he kept scanning the tree line, the way his hand drifted unconsciously toward his knife. We ate our evening meal in relative silence, both of us listening for sounds that didn't come. The absence of normal forest noise was more unsettling than any threat we might have identified. It was as if the entire mountain had decided to hold its breath. The sun disappeared behind the western ridges, and darkness fell quickly in the deep valleys below us. We built our fire smaller than usual, just enough for warmth and to boil water for coffee. The flames cast dancing shadows among the boulders, creating a small circle of light in an ocean of blackness. I was cleaning my rifle when the first sound reached us. It started low, almost below the threshold of hearing. A rumbling that seemed to come from deep in the valley, echoing off the mountainsides until it was impossible to pinpoint its source. At first, I thought it might be thunder from a distant storm, but the sky above was clear and full of stars. The sound repeated, longer this time, with a different quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. My partner had stopped what he was doing and was staring into the darkness beyond our fire. His body language had changed completely, shifting from relaxed alertness to something approaching genuine alarm. Whatever was making that sound, it wasn't anything either of us had encountered before. The call came again, closer now. It had an almost musical quality, like the lowest notes of a pipe organ, but with an organic warmth that no instrument could produce. It rose and fell in complex patterns, seeming to communicate something beyond our understanding. Other sounds answered from different directions, creating a chorus that surrounded our position on the ridge. We extinguished the fire immediately, plunging our small camp into complete darkness. Without the flames, the forest seemed to press closer, the shadows taking on substance and weight. We sat back to back, weapons ready, trying to pierce the blackness with eyes that had grown accustomed to firelight. The calls continued for perhaps 20 minutes, moving around us in a pattern that suggested intelligence and coordination. Whatever was out there was communicating, possibly about us. The sounds would fade into the distance, then return from a completely different direction. Sometimes they seemed to come from the valley below, sometimes from ridges we knew were miles away. Then, as suddenly as they had begun, the calls stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving than the sounds had been. Not the normal quiet of a sleeping forest, but the absolute stillness that comes when every living thing is hiding. We waited in that silence for what felt like hours, muscles cramped from maintaining ready positions, ears straining for any indication of what we were dealing with. It was nearly midnight when we heard the first tree fall. The crash echoed across the valley like a gunshot, followed by the prolonged groaning of wood under impossible stress. Then another tree fell, and another. Something was moving through the forest below us with enough force to snap mature hardwoods like matchsticks. The sounds were getting closer. My partner touched my shoulder and pointed toward a gap in the rocks, where we could observe the valley without exposing ourselves. We low-crawled to the position, keeping our bodies pressed against the cold stone. Below us, perhaps half a mile away, we could see the forest canopy swaying in ways that had nothing to do with wind. A large tree, easily 3 feet in diameter, suddenly bent sideways and toppled with a crash that sent birds exploding from the surrounding woods. The disturbance was moving up the valley in our general direction, leaving a path of destruction that was clearly visible even in the dim starlight. Whatever was down there was massive. The trees it was destroying weren't saplings or dead falls, but mature oak and hickory that would require heavy machinery to move under normal circumstances. Yet something was plowing through them as if they were tall grass. We watched the destruction advance up the valley for another 10 minutes. The path was roughly straight, suggesting purpose rather than random movement. Something was traveling through the forest with a specific destination in mind, and it didn't care what obstacles lay in its path. Then the sound stopped again. The sudden silence was jarring after the continuous noise of falling timber. We kept watching the forest canopy, but nothing moved. Whatever had been down there had either stopped or changed direction. We maintained our observation post for another hour, but the woods remained still. Eventually, we decided one of us should try to get some sleep while the other maintained watch. The normal 4-hour rotation seemed inadequate given what we'd experienced, so we agreed on 2-hour shifts. My partner took the first watch while I tried to rest among the boulders. Sleep came fitfully. Every time I began to drift off, some sound would jerk me back to consciousness. My partner shook me awake at 0200 hours. His face was pale in the starlight, and his hands trembled slightly as he handed me the watch. He'd seen something during his shift, something that had shaken his usual composure. But he said nothing, just rolled into his sleeping bag and closed his eyes tightly. The next 2 hours passed slowly. I scanned the forest below, watching for any sign of movement, listening for sounds that didn't belong. The moon had risen, casting everything in silver and deep shadow. The destruction from earlier was clearly visible now, a swath of broken trees cutting across the valley like a scar. At 0400, I heard footsteps. They were coming from the forest below our position, moving slowly and deliberately up the slope. But these weren't human footsteps. Each one landed with enough force to shake the ground, and the spacing between them suggested a stride length impossible for any person. Whatever was climbing toward us was taking its time, placing each step carefully, perhaps testing our position. I woke my partner with a gentle touch to his shoulder. He came instantly alert, the mark of good training and natural instinct. I pointed down the slope and held up my hand to indicate we should listen. The footsteps continued, closer now, accompanied by the sound of small trees being pushed aside. We had perhaps 5 minutes before whatever was climbing the slope reached our position among the boulders. The smart, tactical move would have been to withdraw immediately, to put distance between ourselves and an unknown threat. But this was a training exercise in a national forest. The worst we should encounter was an instructor trying to test our reactions, or perhaps a curious bear. That's what we told ourselves anyway. The footsteps reached the edge of our boulder field and stopped. In the sudden silence, we could hear breathing. Deep, slow inhalations and exhalations that suggested lungs far larger than those of any human. The sound was coming from perhaps 30 feet away, just beyond the largest of the rock formations that sheltered our camp. Then we smelled it. The odor was unlike anything I'd encountered before or since. It was organic, definitely animal, but with a complexity that suggested intelligence and awareness. Not the simple musk of a bear or deer, but something layered and nuanced, like the scent of a large predator mixed with herbs and earth, and something else I couldn't identify. A rock scraped against stone somewhere very close to our position. Whatever was out there was moving again, but quietly now, with the stealth of something that understood it was being observed. We pressed ourselves deeper into our concealed position, hardly daring to breathe. That's when I saw it. The creature moved between two large boulders, perhaps 20 feet from where we lay hidden. In the moonlight, it appeared as a massive silhouette, easily 8 feet tall and proportionally broad across the shoulders. It moved upright on 2 legs, but with a fluidity and power that was completely inhuman. Its arms were long and heavily muscled, hanging nearly to its knees. Its head was large and seemed to sit directly on its shoulders without much of a neck. The creature paused in the gap between the boulders, and I had the distinct impression it was studying our campsite. Its head turned slowly from side to side, and I caught a glimpse of eyes that reflected the moonlight like mirrors. It knew we were there. I was certain of it. But it made no aggressive moves, showed no signs of hostility. For perhaps 30 seconds, we observed each other in silence. The creature remained perfectly still, a statue carved from shadow and starlight. Beside me, my partner was holding his breath, his body rigid with tension. The only sounds were our own heartbeats and the creature's slow, deep breathing. Then, with movements that were surprisingly graceful for something so large, the creature stepped back into the shadows between the rocks. We heard its footsteps moving away, still careful and deliberate, but gradually fading into the distance. Within a few minutes, the only sounds were the normal nighttime chorus of the forest. We remained in our concealed position until first light, neither of us speaking, both trying to process what we'd witnessed. When dawn finally broke over the eastern ridges, we found ourselves looking at a campsite that showed clear evidence of visitation. Large footprints in the soft earth around our fire pit, each one easily 18 inches long and showing the impression of 5 toes. Broken branches at a height of 8 feet where something had passed between the trees, a lingering odor that the morning breeze couldn't quite dispel. We broke camp quickly and efficiently, neither of us eager to spend more time in that place. Our final checkpoint was only a few miles away, and we covered the distance in record time despite our fatigue and the difficult terrain. The familiar sounds of military activity, helicopters, radio chatter, diesel engines, were more welcome than they'd ever been before. The debriefing was routine, questions about navigation, survival techniques, physical conditioning, mental resilience. We gave the expected answers, focusing on the tactical and technical aspects of our exercise. When asked if we'd encountered anything unusual, we exchanged a brief glance before responding in the negative. But our commanding officer wasn't finished with us. After the other soldiers had been dismissed, he asked us to remain behind. When we were alone in his tent, he studied us for a long moment before speaking. He told us that unusual reports sometimes came out of training exercises in this part of the national forest. Reports that couldn't be explained by conventional means and served no useful military purpose. Such reports, he explained, were not helpful to anyone's career and could result in questions about a soldier's psychological fitness for duty. He suggested that we focus our memories on the valuable training we'd received and the skills we'd developed during our time in the field. The forest was full of shadows and strange sounds that could play tricks on tired minds. What mattered was that we'd successfully completed our mission and proven ourselves capable rangers. We were ordered not to discuss our experience with other soldiers, not to file any written reports beyond the standard after-action summaries, and to consider the matter closed. Any future references to unusual encounters during training exercises would be viewed as detrimental to unit cohesion and military discipline. The message was clear. We'd seen what we'd seen, but officially we'd seen nothing at all. I completed ranger training 2 weeks later and returned to my reserve unit. My partner was assigned to a different post, and I never saw him again. Over the years, I've wondered if he thinks about that night on the ridge, if the memory haunts him the way it haunts me. Because I do think about it. Often, I think about the intelligence in those reflected eyes, the careful way the creature moved, the sense of being studied by something that understood far more than it revealed. I think about the calls that seem to carry complex meaning, the coordinated movement through the forest, the deliberate approach to our position. Most of all, I think about the fact that it could have harmed us easily but chose not to. Whatever we encountered that night in the Chattahoochee National Forest was not just a large animal. It was something that made conscious decisions, something that possessed a form of intelligence we didn't understand. The official records show that our training exercise was completed successfully with no incidents of note. 2 reserve soldiers demonstrated satisfactory performance in wilderness survival and navigation. Standard stuff, filed away and forgotten. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is moving through trees outside my window, I hear echoes of those calls from the Georgia mountains. And I remember what it felt like to be observed by something ancient and powerful, something that belonged to the forest in ways humans never could. The Army trained us to be invisible, to move through enemy territory without being detected. But that night, we learned what it truly meant to be watched by something that was better at the game than we were. Something that had been perfecting the art of remaining hidden long before the first human ever set foot in those mountains. I've never returned to the Chattahoochee National Forest. I tell myself it's because I'm older now, less interested in hiking and camping. But the truth is simpler than that. Some places change you, and once changed, you can never go back to what you were before. That ridge line in North Georgia changed me. It taught me that the world is larger and stranger than any training manual suggests, full of mysteries that official reports can't capture and experiences that don't fit neatly into military categories. I served my country for 22 years after that night, retiring as a senior non-commissioned officer with commendations for leadership and technical expertise. I've trained soldiers, led missions, and faced dangers in several different theaters of operation. But nothing I experienced in all those years of military service compares to those few minutes on a Georgia mountain ridge when something vast and unknowable chose to reveal itself to 2 young soldiers who were just trying to prove they belonged in the ranks of the Rangers. The encounter lasted perhaps 5 minutes from start to finish, 5 minutes out of a 48-hour training exercise, out of a 30-year military career, out of a lifetime of accumulated experiences. But those 5 minutes contain more wonder and terror and pure mystery than all the rest combined. I keep the secret because I was ordered to, because speaking of it would serve no useful purpose, because the official world has no place for such stories. But I also keep it because some experiences are too profound to share casually, too important to risk having them diminished by skepticism or misunderstanding. The creature we encountered that night was real. I know this with the same certainty I know my own name. It was intelligent, aware, and capable of making complex decisions about how to interact with the strange bipedal visitors who had wandered into its territory. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, moving through the deep woods of the Appalachians, following game trails known only to itself. Sometimes I imagine it remembers that night on the ridge as clearly as I do, filing the encounter away in whatever passes for memory in a mind so different from our own. But mostly, I just remember the eyes, intelligent eyes that studied us with the same curiosity we felt toward them. Eyes that belonged to something that had every right to call those mountains home, something that had been there long before Rangers started training in the Chattahoochee National Forest and would be there long after the last soldier had departed. But our story didn't end with that first encounter on the ridge. The creature's visit had marked us in ways we didn't immediately understand, creating a connection to that place that would draw us back years later under circumstances neither of us could have anticipated. It was 1997, 14 years after our initial training exercise, when I received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was older, rougher around the edges, but unmistakably familiar. My former partner had tracked me down through military records, reaching out after more than a decade of silence. He was working as a civilian contractor now, he explained, providing survival training to various government agencies. A new assignment had brought him back to the Chattahoochee National Forest, to the same general area where we'd encountered the impossible all those years ago. He needed someone he could trust, someone who understood what we'd experienced that night on the ridge. 3 park rangers had gone missing over the past 6 months, all experienced woodsmen, all familiar with the terrain, all vanished without a trace in the same remote section of forest where we'd completed our training. Search and rescue teams had found no sign of struggle, no equipment, no bodies, just empty forest and unanswered questions. The official theory was that the men had fallen victim to accidents, but rangers reporting strange calls echoing through the valleys, evidence of large trees being moved or broken in ways that defied explanation, a pervasive sense of being watched during search operations. He wanted me to join him for an unofficial reconnaissance, a chance to revisit the area and see if we could find any connection between the missing men and what we'd encountered years before. It wasn't a military operation, he stressed. Just two former soldiers trying to understand whether their shared experience might shed light on a current mystery. I should have said no. My active duty days were behind me. I had a family and civilian responsibilities, and there was no logical reason to believe our encounter could explain the disappearances. But something in his voice, a note of urgency mixed with fear, convinced me to take leave from my job and drive down to Georgia. We met at a ranger station on the edge of the national forest. My partner looked older, grayer, but still possessed the lean efficiency that had impressed me during our training. He'd brought detailed topographical maps, photographs of the missing men, and copies of the search reports that had been shared with his training team. The three rangers had disappeared in different locations, but all within a roughly triangular area that encompassed the ridge where we'd made our encounter. The third ranger had been the most experienced of the group, a 20-year veteran who knew the Chattahoochee better than anyone. He'd been investigating reports of illegal camping in a restricted watershed area. His last radio contact placed him less than 2 miles from our old training site. That was 3 weeks ago. We studied the reports and maps throughout the afternoon, looking for patterns that might not be obvious to searchers unfamiliar with our experience. The distribution of the disappearances did seem to follow game trails and water sources in the deep forest, areas where large animals might travel regularly. More significantly, all three men had vanished during periods when other hikers and campers reported hearing unusual sounds in the forest. As evening approached, we loaded our packs with minimal gear and headed into the woods. We both carried more sophisticated equipment than we'd had during our original training: GPS units, satellite phones, night vision devices, but we traveled light, planning to cover ground quickly rather than establish permanent camps. The forest had changed in the 14 years since our first visit. Some areas showed the effects of logging operations and trail improvements, while others seemed wilder and more overgrown than before. We reached the general area of our original encounter just as darkness was settling over the mountains. The ridge looked different in the autumn light, but the fundamental geography was unchanged. We could see the boulder field where we'd hidden, the valley where we'd watched trees being destroyed, the game trails that wound between ancient hardwoods. We made camp in a different location this time, choosing a spot that offered multiple escape routes and clear sight lines in several directions. Neither of us spoke about our tactical preparations, but we both understood that this wasn't a nostalgic visit to an old training site. We were looking for answers to questions that had haunted us for over a decade. The first 2 nights passed without incident. We found nothing conclusive, a few tracks in soft earth that could have been made by anything, some broken branches at unusual heights, areas where the normal forest sounds seemed muted. But we both felt it again. That sense of being observed, of moving through territory controlled by something that understood our presence better than we understood its. The feeling had been subtle during our original encounter, masked by fatigue and the general stress of training. Now, with years of experience and mature judgment, we recognized it for what it was: the awareness that comes from being studied by a superior intelligence. On the third night, as we sat around a carefully contained fire, my partner finally voiced what we'd both been thinking. The missing rangers hadn't simply disappeared, they'd been taken. Something in these mountains was actively removing human beings who ventured too deep into its territory, doing so with a skill and stealth that left no evidence conventional searchers could interpret. The question was whether we were dealing with the same creature we'd encountered years before, or something else entirely. We were discussing these possibilities when the calls began again. They started low and distant, just as they had during our training exercise. But this time they seemed more urgent, more complex in their patterns and variations. Multiple voices answered from different directions, creating a 3-dimensional chorus that surrounded our position completely. We extinguished our fire and took defensive positions among the trees, but this time we were better prepared. Night vision devices revealed the forest in eerie green detail, showing us movement that would have been invisible to the naked eye. Our GPS units confirmed our exact location, and satellite phones provided a link to the outside world if we needed emergency extraction. The calls continued for nearly an hour, sometimes close enough to shake the ground beneath our feet, sometimes so distant they seemed to come from other mountains entirely. Then the forest fell silent. We waited in our positions, scanning the darkness through our night vision equipment, every sense focused on detecting movement or threat. Minutes passed without sound or motion. Then, at the very edge of our vision, we saw them. 3 figures moving through the trees with the fluid grace of natural predators. They were massive, easily matching the size of the creature we'd encountered during training, but their coordinated movement suggested a level of organization we hadn't witnessed before. They traveled in a loose formation, maintaining spacing that allowed them to cover more ground while remaining in visual contact with each other. They were hunting. The realization struck us both simultaneously. These creatures weren't simply moving through their territory, they were conducting a systematic search, following patterns and protocols that spoke of intelligence and planning. They moved from concealment to concealment, pausing to scan their surroundings before advancing to the next position. And they were heading directly toward our location. We had perhaps 10 minutes before they reached our defensive position. We made a decision that would have seemed insane to our younger selves. We decided to make contact. My partner activated a small LED flashlight, covering most of its beam with his fingers to create a dim red glow. He pointed the light toward the approaching figures and flashed it 3 times, then waited. After a moment, he repeated the signal. The creatures stopped moving. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, from the darkness ahead of us came a response. Not light, but sound. 3 low calls that perfectly mimicked the pattern of the flashlight signals. They had understood our attempt at communication and were responding in kind. What followed was unlike anything in my military experience or civilian life. For the next 2 hours, we engaged in a primitive but unmistakable form of communication with beings whose existence defied every scientific and military category I'd ever learned. They approached slowly, stopping frequently to gauge our reactions. We remained in our positions but made no aggressive moves, keeping our weapons ready but not raised. When they were close enough for clear observation through our night vision equipment, they settled into positions that mirrored our own defensive arrangement. We could see them clearly now. 3 creatures, each slightly different in size and build, but all unmistakably members of the same species we'd encountered years before. Their faces were partially human, partially something else entirely. Their eyes reflected our infrared illumination, watching us with an intelligence that was both alien and strangely familiar. The largest of the 3, clearly the leader, began a series of gestures that seemed designed to convey meaning. It pointed toward the valley below, then back toward us, then made a sweeping motion that encompassed the entire forest. The message seemed clear. This was their territory, and we were guests whose behavior would determine our welcome. My partner responded by pointing to himself, then to me, then making a walking motion with his fingers. He was trying to communicate that we were travelers, passing through rather than establishing permanent presence. The creature watched his gestures carefully, then nodded in what appeared to be understanding. What happened next was the most remarkable part of the entire encounter. The leader reached into what appeared to be a pouch or bag made from woven plant fibers and withdrew 3 objects. Even through our night vision equipment, we could see they were personal items: a wallet, a radio, and what looked like a park ranger's badge. The missing rangers. The creature placed the items on the ground between us, then backed away to its original position. The message was clear. They had taken the rangers, and now they were returning their possessions as some form of communication or offering. My partner and I exchanged glances, understanding that we were witnessing something unprecedented. These creatures hadn't simply killed the missing men in territorial disputes. They had captured them, possibly studied them, and now were using their possessions to communicate with us. But where were the rangers themselves? As if sensing our question, the leader gestured toward the deep forest, making a complex series of motions that suggested movement over long distances. Then it pointed to the items on the ground and made what could only be interpreted as a negative gesture, a shaking of its massive head. The rangers were gone, taken somewhere beyond recovery, but the creatures wanted us to know what had happened. wanted to establish some form of understanding about territorial boundaries and acceptable behavior in their domain. Through gestures, sounds, and an intuitive understanding that transcended language barriers, we learned that the creatures had been aware of human activity in their territory for generations. They had developed strategies for avoiding contact, for remaining hidden while coexisting with the growing human presence in the national forest. But something had changed recently. Human activity had increased, penetrating deeper into areas that had previously been undisturbed. The missing rangers had crossed invisible boundaries, had persisted in areas where their presence was not tolerated. The creatures had responded according to their own laws and customs, removing threats to their continued secrecy. They were simply protecting their territory and their existence using methods that seemed reasonable to their own understanding. That's why they had revealed themselves to us. They remembered our encounter years before, when we had observed them without attacking, had kept their secret without betraying their existence. They were hoping to establish communication with humans who might understand the need for boundaries and discretion. The leader reached into its pouch again and withdrew a small object that it placed near the ranger's belongings. Through our night vision, we could see it was carved from wood, shaped into a form that was both abstract and somehow meaningful. It was clearly handmade, a product of intelligence and artistic capability. Then, as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the three creatures began to withdraw. They moved with the same coordinated precision they had shown while approaching, fading back into the forest with a skill that made our own military training seem crude by comparison. Before disappearing completely, the leader turned back toward our position and made one final gesture. It pointed to the objects on the ground, then to us, then made a motion toward the outside world. The meaning was unmistakable. Take these things, tell the story, but tell it carefully. We waited until full daylight before approaching the items they had left. The rangers' possessions were exactly what they appeared to be, personal effects that confirmed the fate of the missing men. But the carved object was something else entirely, a piece of evidence that proved the existence of a culture and intelligence operating just beyond the edges of human awareness. We spent the rest of that day hiking out of the forest, both of us silent as we processed what we had experienced. By the time we reached civilization, we had agreed on a course of action that balanced our obligations to the missing rangers' families with our understanding of the larger situation. We reported the discovery of the rangers' belongings to the appropriate authorities, providing GPS coordinates and detailed accounts of where the items had been found. We described evidence of large animal activity in the area, unusual tracks and disturbances that suggested the involvement of creatures unfamiliar to local wildlife experts. But we said nothing about the communication, the organized behavior, or the clear evidence of intelligence we had witnessed. The carved object remained in my possession, hidden away as proof of an encounter that could never be officially acknowledged. Over the years, I've studied it countless times, trying to understand its meaning and significance. It appears to be a map of sorts, showing the topography of the national forest with markers that might indicate territorial boundaries or sites of special importance. The official investigation concluded that the three rangers had fallen victim to a large predator, possibly a bear or mountain lion acting unusually aggressively. The case was closed, the families received compensation, and the area was temporarily restricted to prevent further incidents. But I knew the truth was more complex than any official report could acknowledge. The creatures we had encountered were not mindless predators, but intelligent beings trying to protect their existence in a world increasingly dominated by human activity. The experience changed both of us in ways that extended far beyond our original encounter. My partner left his contracting work and became an advocate for wilderness preservation, dedicating his remaining career to protecting habitats where unknown species might still exist undisturbed. Years have passed since that second encounter, and I've often wondered whether the communication achieved its intended purpose. Have other humans crossed into territory they didn't understand? Have the creatures been forced to take defensive action again? The forest keeps its secrets, and we learn to keep ours. But on quiet nights when the world seems full of ordinary explanations for ordinary things, I remember what it felt like to brush against something extraordinary. The mountains of North Georgia taught us more than any manual ever could about the nature of respect, humility, and the vast unknowns that exist just beyond the edges of our carefully mapped and categorized world. Some lessons can only be learned in darkness, in silence, in moments when the ordinary rules no longer apply. The carved object sits in a drawer in my study, wrapped in cloth and hidden from casual observation. But sometimes I take it out and hold it, feeling the smooth wood worn by hands unlike any humans, shaped by a mind operating according to principles I may never fully understand. It serves as a reminder that the world is larger and stranger than any training manual suggests, full of mysteries that official reports can't capture, and experiences that don't fit neatly into any category we've created for organizing reality. And it reminds me that somewhere in the mountains of North Georgia, ancient intelligences continue their careful existence, protecting secrets that humanity may not be ready to acknowledge, maintaining boundaries that allow two very different species to share the same world without destroying each other. For more interesting stories, check this out.